What if Sarah Miller never died the night the outbreak began? Let's explore the depths of that world.
Sir, we are not sick!
Joel Miller grips the wheel of a battered pickup truck as chaos erupts around him. Sirens wail in the distance. Helicopters streak across the burning sky. In the seat beside him, Sarah clutches her side, hurt, frightened, but alive. This time, the soldier's bullet never reaches her. It finds an infected behind them instead. Tommy pulled the trigger just in time. They vanish into the night, driving straight into 20 years of ruin. But everything is different now. Joel doesn't shatter. He doesn't bury his soul beneath anger and loss. Not when his daughter is still beside him. Not when he has something to hold on to. Civilization still falls. FEDRA rises from the ashes. The Fireflies light their rebellion. And somewhere, a young girl named Ellie is growing up behind concrete walls, immune, isolated, and unaware of what she might become. When she and Joel finally meet, he isn't a hollow man clinging to the past. He's a father still learning how to protect the future. And Sarah, now older, watches Ellie with cautious eyes, unsure if this girl is a threat, a miracle, or something in between. Because in this world, survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about who you choose to live for. And for Joel Miller, that answer is no longer simple. Every town they passed through felt emptier than the last. Cities swallowed by vines and silence. Skeletons in cars, names forgotten, stories erased. But Joel kept them moving. He had done it before, alone, hardened, numb. Now, with two girls walking behind him, the weight was different. He wasn't dragging his grief through the wasteland anymore. He was carrying it. Sarah began to change. The world had already taken her childhood, but now it chipped away at her certainty. She had always known her father as someone unshakable. But Joel hesitated more often now. He looked over his shoulder longer. He flinched when Ellie coughed. Ellie, for all her sharp edges, began to soften. She tried to earn Sarah's approval in small ways, sharing food, taking the first watch, pushing forward when the cold bit at their bones. But there was always a wall between them, built from the past, held together by everything they didn't say. They lost people, travelers who walked with them for a week, maybe two. Some didn't make it past the next tunnel. Others chose to stay behind. Infection rarely came with a warning. One night, someone was laughing at an old joke. The next, their blood was on the snow. Sarah buried most of them. Joel used to. Now he just watched. They grew leaner, quieter. Their world shrank to the sound of footsteps and the rustle of wind in broken windows. Fireflies flickered at the edge of rumor, always a day too far, a promise too late. But the mission never changed. Ellie had to get somewhere. Someone out there still believed her blood could matter. And so, they pressed on. By the time spring crept back into the world, the three of them had crossed mountains, rivers, and the remnants of countless forgotten lives. Their clothes were torn, their hands calloused, their eyes older than they had any right to be. But they were still moving. And in a world where the dead outnumbered the living, that was enough to be called hope. Their journey eventually pulled them toward the Rocky Mountains. Rumors of a Firefly outpost hidden in an old university had spread through the remnants of trading circles. Joel latched onto it, not because he believed, but because he needed something to believe in. The others followed, not knowing what waited, only that forward still seemed safer than standing still. In the high passes, food ran low. Snow returned without warning. One morning the sky opened, and the storm that came nearly buried them alive. They found shelter in an abandoned ski lodge, half burned, half standing. Days passed in the cold. No voices, no light, just the wind, the creaking wood, and the weight of breath in the dark. It was in places like this that the past came back, not as memories, but as ghosts, echoes in the silence. Joel grew distant. Sarah noticed. Ellie stayed close, never asking, always watching. At night, she whispered to herself. Sarah pretended not to hear. When the storm cleared, they continued on foot. Joel's limp from an old injury worsened. He tried to hide it. They let him. Along the river valley, they encountered a camp. Not fireflies. Smugglers, scavengers, people who had learned to live by taking. At first, they were offered warmth, a place to rest. But the calm didn't last. On the third night, their hosts were gone. So was most of their gear. The three were left with only what they could carry on their backs and a warning scratched into the wall. Keep the girl moving. You're not the only ones looking for her. It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. From then on, they changed routes often, doubled back through forests, avoided cities altogether. Trust became currency they could no longer afford. Sarah began marking trees as they moved, developing her own silent system for tracking paths, dangers, and dead ends. Joel said nothing, but he started following her marks. Ellie became quieter. Her jokes faded. Her questions stopped. What once made her resilient now turned brittle. She slept less. She flinched more. Sometimes she walked a few steps ahead, always checking, always bracing. Spring gave way to the wet heat of early summer. Nature crept back in places where humans had vanished. The world looked alive again, but it was only pretending. Then, near the edge of a collapsed highway, they found something unexpected. A firefly symbol, freshly painted, bright and dripping. Beneath it a note. Immunity confirmed. We are close. Keep her safe. There was no signature, just coordinates. A place they'd never been, buried deep in what used to be Utah. They stood there for a long time, saying nothing. No one asked if they'd go, because they already knew. They moved quietly through the desert, skirting what remained of old suburbs and buried towns. The landscape had long since dried out, the roads lost under windblown sand. But occasionally they found signs of something recent. An old fire pit, footprints too fresh to be theirs, cans missing their labels but not yet rusted through. Joel stayed alert, walking slower than usual. Sarah noticed but said nothing. Ellie watched both of them, her steps quieter, more deliberate than before. She was changing, the same way Sarah had changed in the early years, more cautious, less hopeful. By the time they reached the edge of Salt Lake City, summer had turned to early fall. The trees here had begun to turn, a slow golden burn creeping into the leaves. It would have been beautiful once. Now it only meant colder nights and shorter days. They moved through the outskirts carefully, avoiding open roads, sticking to alleyways and collapsed rooftops. Ellie coughed more often than before, though she always waved it off. Joel pretended not to hear it. Sarah didn't. The city was quieter than they expected. Too quiet. The Fireflies, if they had ever been there, were gone now. What they found instead were outposts stripped for parts, old radio equipment smashed beyond use, and walls covered with faded propaganda. Joel didn't trust anything. He searched every floor, every hallway, every stairwell like there was still something worth finding. But there wasn't. Just decay and dust. As the days stretched on, the silence became heavier. They had fewer conversations, fewer plans. No one said what they were thinking, that maybe they had come too far for nothing, that maybe the last chance they had to hand Ellie off to someone who could help her was already gone. They stayed longer than they should have, moving from one building to the next, hoping something might still be buried beneath the rubble. When the food began to run low, Joel finally made the call to keep moving. South again. Warmer, maybe safer. Not better, but something. It was Sarah who found the map, folded behind a filing cabinet in what looked like a converted hospital. She studied it late into the night, marking it with a pencil she had sharpened down to its metal base. Ellie watched her from across the room, saying nothing, her hands resting over her backpack like it might disappear if she let it go. They left the city the next morning without speaking. Behind them, smoke rose from a fire someone else had lit. Whoever had followed them was close now, and for the first time in weeks, they didn't feel like the only ones out there. They moved through the canyons with slower steps now. The heat was unrelenting during the day, forcing them into caves, tunnels, or the shells of rusted vehicles scattered along the old interstate. At night, the desert came alive. Wind howled through broken fences. Coyotes called in the distance. Sometimes they saw fires on ridges above them, never too close, never far enough. They weren't alone. The attacks didn't come suddenly. First, the signs. Fresh tire tracks across sand. Bullet casings not yet dulled by rust. Carcasses of animals that hadn't died naturally. Joel noticed them, but Sarah was the first to understand the pattern. Whoever was following them wasn't chasing them blindly. They were steering them, herding them in a direction.
One night, Sarah found a tripwire stretched low between two trees. Another night, Ellie spotted a camera lens buried inside a broken lamppost. Neither of them said much. Joel had stopped sleeping entirely, eyes darting at the slightest sound. The pressure around them had become constant, like walking inside a closing fist. Still, they pressed on. Near the edge of a floodplain, they came across a half-sunken bus turned makeshift checkpoint. The Firefly symbol had been crudely painted over with black tar, but it still bled through in places. Inside, they found the remnants of a field lab. Metal cots, broken IV drips, notebooks scorched around the edges. Sarah sifted through pages, reading aloud quietly to herself, while Joel kept his back to the wall. Ellie sat in a corner watching both of them. The files weren't from doctors, they were from hunters. Surveillance logs, capture orders, blood charts. Ellie's name appeared more than once. So did others. Crossed out. Terminated. Only Ellie's remained unchecked. At the bottom of the final page, someone had written in pencil, "Last viable host, do not kill. Wait for signal." They left the bus before sunrise. No one spoke. But something in the air had changed. Ellie knew now what Joel and Sarah had suspected. She wasn't being protected. She was being collected. By the time they reached the edge of what used to be an airport, Joel was barely keeping up. His side, wounded weeks ago in a fall, had reopened, the infection spreading down to his hip. The walk became a limp, then a stagger. He tried to hide it, brushing away Sarah's hand whenever she offered to take his pack, waving off Ellie's concerned looks with silence. The airport had collapsed inward, its hangars buried beneath weeds and steel. Vines hung like ropes from torn roofs. In the control tower, they found a rusted signal beacon still pulsing with a faint green light. The code it repeated was simple, desperate. Still here, still alive, still waiting. They stayed for 3 nights. Each day brought new sounds from the forest beyond the runway. Distant engines. Muffled voices. Someone was closing in. Sarah took command. She mapped exits. She sealed rooms. She broke down rifles and reassembled them from memory. Ellie watched her differently now, not just as a survivor, but as someone dangerous, someone who could do what Joel used to do, only without hesitation. On the second night, a flare lit the horizon. Red, then white. On the third, a drone flew overhead, silent and barely visible. It didn't drop anything. It didn't shoot. It just watched. Joel knew he couldn't run anymore. Not far. Not fast. He sat Ellie down and told her the truth. Not about the Fireflies, not about what had come before, but about what was coming. He was slowing them down. Sarah could get Ellie the rest of the way. That was the only path left. But Ellie refused to leave him. So did Sarah. They had made it too far. Lost too much. What waited ahead wasn't salvation. It was just another fire to walk through. On the 4th night, the forest went quiet. Then came the first bullet,
Not a warning. Not a signal. It went through the window of the tower, into Joel's shoulder, knocking him backwards with a sharp crack. Sarah dragged him to cover while Ellie fired blindly into the dark. More bullets came. They weren't surrounded, not yet. But whoever was out there knew the terrain. They fought through the night. Sarah laid traps through the hangar corridors. Ellie loaded weapons as fast as she could. Joel, bleeding and pale, gave directions in short gasps. It wasn't a battle. It was a retreat through a graveyard of steel and shattered glass. By dawn, the attackers had withdrawn. Not defeated, just patient. They were testing them, and now they knew one thing for certain. The ones hunting Ellie weren't Fireflies. They were something else entirely. The days after the airport became a blur. They moved at night, only after confirming they weren't being tailed. Sarah led them through dried marshland, collapsed train tunnels, and long-forgotten FEMA camps rotting in the sun. Every path was slower. Joel could barely walk without a crutch now, an old rifle barrel stripped and repurposed. His breathing was sharp and shallow. The color had drained from his face. But he never asked to stop. Sarah rationed what little antibiotics they had left, grinding expired pills into powder and forcing them down his throat with water they'd boiled twice over. Ellie stayed close, scanning the horizon with a rifle almost too heavy for her to lift. The fear in her eyes had hardened into something else, something colder. She didn't just want to survive anymore. She wanted to understand why she had to. They came across a survivor town. A fortified school gym turned into a trade outpost. Half the residents were sick. The other half didn't talk much. A woman behind a plastic curtain offered them rest for the night, food and a map in exchange for nothing but silence. Sarah didn't trust it. Joel didn't argue. Ellie wandered into the corner of the gym and stared at an old photo hanging sideways on the wall. Kids in prom dresses, smiling in a world that didn't exist anymore. Later that night, Sarah found a terminal powered by a car battery. The files on the screen weren't local. They were satellite feeds, partial logs from surveillance drones that had flown over the Firefly facilities months ago. Some of the footage showed the same bus they had found earlier. Another showed a convoy leaving Salt Lake City, but the final frame froze her cold. A medical tent, a body strapped to a gurney, tubes, blood, a girl. Not Ellie, but someone like her. Young, pale, motionless. The file ended there. When Sarah stepped outside, the town was gone. People scattered, no lights, doors left open, no signs of struggle, just absence. Like the entire place had been wiped clean in minutes. On the street, in the dust, a single set of boot prints trailed off into the brush. At the end of them, half buried in the dirt, was a Firefly tag. Except the logo had been crossed out with a jagged red line. By the time she got back, Joel was unconscious again. Ellie sat next to him, hands covered in blood from trying to stop the bleeding. They had overstayed. They moved that night without stopping, past the town, past the hills, toward the final set of coordinates. The outpost had sprung to life, humming with a sterile, artificial rhythm. Cold light spilled from ceiling panels, casting long shadows across surgical equipment that looked untouched by time. Sarah moved first, scanning corners and camera lenses, while Joel leaned against the wall, pale, weakened, but alert. Ellie stood in the center of the room, her eyes fixed on a metallic chair bolted to the floor. Strapped above it, mechanical arms hung motionless, like a trap waiting to close.
This wasn't an abandoned facility. It was a stage. And they had arrived on cue. Screens flickered to life one by one, displaying fragmented footage. Ellie walking through desert roads, Sarah patching Joel's side in a ruined gas station, even their arrival at the gates. Every step of their journey had been tracked, every decision observed. They hadn't escaped their past. They had been guided toward it. Sarah found the main console and scanned the last logged entries. The files weren't detailed. They didn't need to be. One entry stood out. Subject 022. Immune. Viability confirmed.
Procedure authorized upon arrival. There were no doctors present, no guards, only silence and readiness. Moments later, a wall panel slid open and the air shifted. Boots pressed against the floor with practiced precision, clean, calculated. 3 armed figures entered, each wearing blank masks and reinforced vests, their weapons lowered but ready. Behind them came a woman in a scorched white coat, her insignia half-burned, but recognizable. Her expression wasn't triumphant. It was resolved. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Everything had been designed to lead to this moment. Joel remained still, but Sarah could see the fury beneath the surface, controlled, exhausted, and burning. The pain in his side had slowed his body, but not his judgment. His eyes moved from Ellie to the chair, to the figures behind it. He had made this choice before, and lost everything because of it. This time, it wasn't his choice. Ellie stepped forward without prompting. Her shoulders didn't shake. Her hands didn't tremble. She had seen too much, lost too many, and carried too great a burden to hesitate now. Sarah tried to stop her with a glance, but it was too late. Ellie wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She was surrendering, but not in weakness. In control. Joel didn't move. Not toward her. Not away. He simply watched, as if trying to memorize every detail before it slipped through his fingers. Sarah stood frozen, torn between instinct and inevitability. There was no one left to fight, no clear enemy to kill, no righteous cause to rally behind. There was only choice, and that made it worse. Ellie laid herself onto the chair without a word. The restraints clicked into place automatically, precise and silent. The room brightened slightly as the machinery came to life. Tubes slithered into position, syringes adjusted. The cold hum of automation swallowed the last remnants of choice from the space. Joel didn't speak. He didn't resist. He simply stood by the wall, still bleeding, watching her silhouette fade beneath the sterile light. Sarah stood frozen just beyond the medical field, her fists clenched at her sides. She had followed Ellie across the country, through the wreckage of cities, through death and fire and betrayal. And now, at the end, all she could do was witness. The procedure didn't begin with violence. It was clinical, rehearsed. Scanners moved over Ellie's skin. Small needles took samples. Her vitals displayed on the wall, stable and strong. Monitors recorded everything. The data Ellie had unknowingly carried all along, hidden in her blood. But something unexpected happened. The system paused. Red lights pulsed faintly along the console. A message appeared, short and chilling. Cerebral response deviation. Procedure risks permanent failure. The equipment stilled. The lights dimmed, and the room went quiet again. It wasn't Ellie's immunity that failed. It was the system that couldn't accept her resistance. Something had changed, something deeper than blood. Years of survival, trauma, and adaptation had made her body unreadable. The cure, if there ever had been one, was no longer accessible. The silence that followed was longer than any they had experienced. Sarah stepped forward slowly, reaching to unbuckle Ellie. Joel didn't move. Ellie stood on her own, pale, quiet, but whole. No one came to stop them. Outside, the facility remained as empty as before. No ambush, no final test, no closing gate. The sun was just beginning to rise beyond the pine trees, casting a weak glow over the decaying buildings and long-dead fences. Joel walked with a limp. Sarah carried the gear. Ellie led the way this time, her steps slow but certain. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. Behind them, the outpost returned to black, as if it had never woken at all. The road stretched endlessly ahead, cracked and crooked beneath their boots. Grass pushed through the ruins of asphalt. The wind was calm now, carrying only the distant sound of birdsong and rustling leaves. No sirens, no screams. Just the quiet of a world still healing, Or at least trying to. They didn't know where they were going. There was no grand destination left, no promised sanctuary, but they walked anyway. Sarah walked a few steps behind Ellie now, not as her protector, but as her equal. Joel trailed furthest back, every step slower than the last, yet unyielding. The father who once lost everything had now crossed a continent with the weight of 2 futures on his shoulders. And for once, he didn't fear what lay ahead. There was no cure, but there was still life. They had not saved the world, but they had saved each other. And sometimes in the ruins of all that was enough. If this journey moved you, even just a little, consider supporting the channel by leaving a like and subscribing. We dive deep into the worlds we love, asking the questions no one dares to. And now we ask you, what would you have done if Sarah had lived? Would you have let Ellie choose? Share your thoughts below. We read every comment. Until next time, stay curious and stay human.